It's a great pleasure to have Mahesh Rangarajan here. And it's also welcome to, I think, the first talk on environmental science for our first year BSc students. Hands up. And the MSc students. Yes, wonderful. And it's also, I think, for us a chance to get all of you in the group together. We've been very fortunate to have Mahesh visiting us number of times on campus, usually for the climate festivals that we run every year. But it's the first time he's giving us a talk on campus. That said, he inaugurated our Let's Talk Climate Change series, public lecture series at Bangalore International Center. And that talk is up on YouTube. So please look at our YouTube channel and look at Revisiting the Anthropocene, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. And it's a wonderful talk. You should definitely listen to that. I'll do a very quick introduction, which will not do him justice. I've had the pleasure of knowing Mahesh and interacting with him work-wise for about 30 years now, which is a very long time. Mahesh Rangarajan has a PhD in Oxford and is one of India's best-known environmental historians. For those of you, some of you would know that he also has an alternate interest, deep interest, and work interest also in psephology, which is electoral history analysis. So he does some very interesting things which are not just related to environmental history, but deeply interconnected in many ways. He has worked and taught at a number of institutions, including Cornell University, Delhi University, National Center for Biological Sciences, Jadavpur University, and many other places. Many of his books are very, very well known, and India's Wildlife History is one of them. Fencing the Forest is another of them. You'll find them as classroom readings across many Indian classrooms and internationally. And he is just simply one of the best speakers I know, as you'll see in the next talk. So over to you, Mahesh.
All the things most dangerous. It is quite frightening to be told you're one of the best speakers that the chair has ever heard. But since she's an old friend, you can forgive her the indulgence. It's a privilege and pleasure to be at this beautiful campus. I just said it's a particular privilege to pose with the bauhinia trees, the purple bauhinia which is in flower, and the guava which unfortunately is not ripe enough to pluck and eat. Maybe a squirrel might eat little of it, or a parakeet. I couldn't be tempted. And I was told we're not allowed to pluck the fruit anyway. But I've been coming to this campus long enough to remember many of these trees as small saplings. When many of you in this audience were probably in high school, or you were in your bachelor's, or you were in your master's, or whatever. I think the issue of global environmental change is well upon us. There are people who deny that there is global environmental change. Some of them happen to be in extremely powerful positions. One may not realize it. It includes several leaders of countries who may say one thing in public, but the way they act doesn't quite indicate they grasp the enormity of the situation. And certainly it is true of much of the business communities and corporate elites. My sense is that this is not true of citizens for immediate reasons. In a number of ways, the nature of environmental change is not about the local community, the city, the village, the region, or even the nation state. You know, one of the things you're struck as a student of history is that not only has the number of humans grown, it has. Roughly speaking, the number of humans on Earth went up fourfold in the 20th century. So for every one person there was in 1900, there were 4 in 2000. That's easy. But what is more interesting is that the 20th century saw the collapse of a number of empires. You know, there were 2 great wars, the Great War or the First World War, and then the Second World War. I remember 2 very distinguished lawyers. They're so distinguished if I tell you who. And they insisted once in a long car ride that when they were fighting the First World War, the people fighting it knew there would be a Second World War. And they thought that students of history were very silly not to know this, that 2 always comes after 1. Actually, the reverse is true. After the Great War or the First World War, statesmen across the world were convinced that they should do whatever is required to avert such a great conflagration. It's a different matter that they failed and there was another. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that both these wars ended in long periods of peace, which were actually periods of armored peace. There was a great arms race after the First World War, or particularly between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and also between Imperial Japan and the United States. And these were the great combatants of the war. And the Second World War gave way to something which had ended by most of the time people in this room were born. I've lived through it. It was called the Cold War. And it wasn't a war when it actually got really cold. It was an ideological war between two great systems, the socialist and the capitalist, or the one-party system and the multi-party system, or the centrally planned economy and the free market economy. But one of the things which is very interesting is that these two major wars shook up the world and led to the breakup of empires. And so by the end of the 20th century, the number of nation states on earth went up fourfold. Today there are about 200. When the UN Charter was signed, somewhere on the middle of the 20th century, 1945, there were only 48 countries signing it. For us in this room, and I think it's relevant for us, only 9 of these countries was Asian. So we are living at a very interesting time. Global environmental change is happening. Precisely at the time, countries across Asia and Africa are beginning to find a voice. In the late 20th century, these countries became independent politically. In the 21st century, the question is, will they become independent economically? The Latin American story is slightly different. Latin America, there was a vice president of the United States. It always astonishes me, some of the people who get elected in that country, called Dan Quayle. And he was told that, Mr. Vice President, next week you're going to Latin America, and are you looking forward to the visit? He said, I am, but I don't speak any Latin, so I don't know how they'll understand me. He didn't know that in Latin America, they don't speak Latin. They speak Spanish and Portuguese and several other languages. But Latin America became independent somewhat earlier in the 1820s. But in many ways, it remained economically dependent on the Western world, the richer countries. Now, one of the dilemmas, therefore, of global environmental changes, who's going to pay for the repair? Who's going to pay for the cleanup? And as you perhaps know, the first time the United Nations decided on an environmental conference, the UN Conference on the Human Environment, was in 1972. It was not a very important subject in those days for the heads of government or the heads of state. So as it turned out, unlike later conferences, such as the one in Rio or Copenhagen or Paris, there were only 2 heads of government. There was the head of government of Sweden, Olof Palme. He had to be there because it was his conference, his big day. And the other was the Prime Minister of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And I find it very interesting that 2 years before that, in a speech in Lusaka to the non-aligned movement, this was a movement of countries trying to stay outside the 2 large armed blocs led by the US and the USSR. Not only did they build up their arms, they supplied lots of other countries, brought them together in military power blocks. So the countries were outside the blocks in the non-aligned movement. And in her speech in 1970, she said that along with the threat of nuclear war, there is a new threat today to the environment, the threat of chemical warfare. And she talked about chemical defoliation in a country called Vietnam. Today in 2025, we are observing the anniversary of the United Nations, 1945. Earlier this month, we observed a very sad anniversary. You may have seen podcasts or, newscasts of the very solemn ceremony of Hiroshima, which no Japanese ever forgets, and of Nagasaki. And I think it's very important to remember that technologies in the 20th century were developed for warfare. And these warfare systems were used against largely civilians. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the bulk of the people killed had nothing to do with the Japanese war effort. They were not working in a munitions factory, a naval dockyard, or in an army base. They were civilians, the people like you and me. And there are people now, and they were interviewed in some of these TV channels, survivors of Hiroshima and the forgotten atom bomb, Nagasaki. There are still Japanese who go to schools. It's going to sound quite horrifying. They take off their shirts and show people their scars. They also tell them their experiences. And of course, the Japanese have very strong views about the use of nuclear weapons. They're the only country on earth against which nuclear weapons have been used, not once, but twice, in the space of 3 days. Well, many years later, the United States got involved in a war in Vietnam, which lasted 10 years, 65 to 75. And in 68, they started something called chemical defoliation. They were fighting guerrillas. The guerrillas came out from the forests and they attacked the South Vietnamese and American troops. So the US president, the previous president had approved of these plans. They started thinking about it. Very young, dynamic, brilliant man who was shot dead very sadly. Jack Kennedy, you may know, November 1963, one of the very infamous and sad assassinations in human history. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, decided and approved of a scheme where these chemical defoliants, Agent Orange, 2,4,5-T, and several others, benzene, heptachlor, were sprayed on these forests. And one of the impacts is the trees drop their leaves and the gorillas won't have cover. I have a major distinction, which is not about me, but about my very distinguished colleague, you can look him up, called Nayan Chanda. Nayan Chanda was the first person on earth, there was only one, everyone else came second, to file a dispatch on the liberation of Saigon by the North Vietnamese troops in 1975. So fluent French speaker. He had covered the Vietnam War since the late 60s. And he had witnessed firsthand the defoliation of the forest in Vietnam and gone with the guerrillas and also with the US Air Force. Remember, he was an Indian. He could go on both sides. So we asked him, what did the guerrillas do? And he said, it's very simple. They threw lots of water on their trucks. And when the truck forded the stream, the heat sensor would not sense them. Because remember, already they have heat sensors. You know, the sensors they had in late 60s, America had very advanced technology. They had heat sensors to tell where they were. So all these guys did is they put cloth and they threw lots of water on it and they hid and kept really quiet. And then, you know, the truck passed. And they built these trails known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So I have a friend who just went to Vietnam and said, oh, Ho Chi Minh Trail? If you pay so many dollars, you can go on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You will be really skilled. The shortest, thinnest person in this room qualifies, others don't. It seems you can crawl through the tunnels. They went into these, they dug this elaborate network of tunnels. Now, what may interest you is that in this war, one of the animals targeted, and I'll come back to this animal, was the elephant. Professor Sukumar, who wrote a very important book on elephants, he's written lots on elephants. He retired from the Indian Institute of Science. He wrote his doctorate on elephants. It's the first and last doctorate on elephants, which was registered, believe it or not, and submitted in the Department of Microbiology. Because the Center for Ecological Sciences didn't exist. I'm sure this will never happen in a university. It happened in IISc. Please ask anyone from IISc how elephant was registered under microbiology. So he brings to our attention that these bombers of the Americans were under instruction to kill any elephant that was used on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Because along with mules and donkeys, the Vietnamese were using these elephants. They'd load lots of guns and things and move them. But they were also under instruction, it sounds extremely tragic, to bomb and eliminate any herds of wild elephants. Because the wild elephants could also be trapped and used by the Vietnamese. So I come to a very interesting part of our story, which is that Asian societies have lived with animals for very long. And in one sense, India is a place to begin this story. When we look at global environmental change, we look at the big story, the elimination of biodiversity. You know, we may be living through the 6th extinction. Many of you know that. Why bore you with more details? You can educate me after the lecture. The denudation of not only forests, but of wetlands and grasslands. Oceanic ecosystems being under threat. Chemical contamination, I just referred to defoliants, but there are a variety of other chemicals. In the 1930s, a German chemist, I think his name was Müller, put together a very important synthetic compound called DDT, diphenyl trichloroethane. I think I got that right. It's one of the hydrochlorine compounds. And one of the things about this compound is that it's not biodegradable. Now, this is very closely related to the Second World War. It is closely related because in the war, men moved around in huge numbers across the world. There were women also, particularly from the Soviet Union, Britain, America, who also fought in the war. Now, all of these people had a problem. They were living in very crowded barracks. When you live in a crowded barracks, there's an animal we don't think about, lice. And then there's another we'd like to think even less about, ticks. We shouldn't, or maybe we should. But the leaders of these armies were very worried that the personnel would be infected by lice and ticks. All right. So what they did, they got hold of DDT in powder form and dusted the bodies of people with DDT. Now what happened at the end of the war is very interesting. They mixed the DDT with oil and sprayed it and killed insects. And from the 40s, 50s, 60s to the 70s, DDT and its related compounds were the mainstay in agriculture and health of the control of what were called pests. Now this is very important. Please keep in mind. There is a notion of chemical technology by which you solve a problem through a linear way of thinking. The linear way of thinking is we will have a non-biodegradable chemical compound which will kill the target animal, in this case lice, ticks, and it could be whatever are the bugs and animals and insects which infest crops. And it could be, not to be forgotten, the malarial mosquito. Right in the 1950s, huge number of people in India were killed because of the malarial mosquito, huge mortalities. And this enabled also the opening up of new areas such as the Tarai in North India was opened up because malarial mosquitoes were eliminated. By the 70s, it was clear they were not being eliminated. They were developing resistance. This becomes evident even earlier, which I'll come to in a moment. But let me come back to the animal part of the story. In one sense, I would see India as very central to these global environmental changes. It's central because of three reasons. One, because if you go back a little in time, let's go back 300 years. We went back 100 years, let's move the reel backward. I think one of the things you learn in history is it's important not only to know where we are, it's important to ask why we're here. What are the particular turns in the road which brought us to this crossroads? What are the ways in which the past has shaped the present? If we know that, we'll be better prepared for the future. We can't predict the future, but we can be better prepared for it. In 1700, India was the most populous country in the planet, probably. Not sure, but probably. 1600 also it was the most populous. The second most populous was China. Surprise, surprise. In the 21st century, we came back to that. China went to the first spot, then there was some jostling India's again in the first spot. Whether it's a cause of celebration or gloom, I leave it to you. Maybe it's both. But what is significant is these were extremely productive economies. Together, they accounted for 55-60% of what is known as the gross domestic product. This is a pre-industrial world, I want to be clear. There's a man called Angus Madison. He's tried to calculate amount of wealth in the last 2,000 years. And it's fascinating that India, largely under the Mughals, not all, large parts of India were not. I was just speaking to a very distinguished professor from Assam. Assam was under the Ahoms. Large parts of South India were not under the Mughals. Their control really didn't extend to the northwest frontier. Whenever they went there, they fought and won in summer and they lost in winter. All right. So not all, but a substantial part. But India was a major exporter of textiles, whether it is through Gujarat or through the ports in Bengal or all along the Coromandel and Malabar coasts. These textiles were prized across Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and interestingly, in the 18th century, what would become the United States of America. So the slaves in the cotton fields in the early 1800s, they used Indian cottons. Very, very good cotton, quality. And there's a fascinating book by a man called Parthasarathi. It's got a lovely title, which I don't think you'll ever forget. It's called Why Europe Got Rich and Asia Did Not. It's a simple title. And the answer is tariff barriers. We're reading about tariff barriers everywhere. Well, the Europeans brought a lot of tariff barriers from the 1720s. 1720s, that early. And they brought them to stop Indian textiles. This is not the only reason. There are many complex reasons. The other, of course, is that by the 18th century, the British start getting a toehold in many parts of India. And they get the Madras army and the Madras sepoys help conquer Bengal in the 1760s. And the conquest of Bengal is a very major turning point. By getting this large, very rich and fertile province, they get the land revenues, which funds the soldiers. And from the 1760s to 1945, Britain becomes a global superpower. There are many reasons for that. One, of course, and it's common with all the European countries, is the control of the oceans. Unfortunately, and this is historically true, the great Asian and Eurasian empires of the 18th century, say the world of 1700, the Mughal or the Timurid, the Qing or the Chinese, the Safavid or the Iranian, and the Ottoman or the Turkish, none of them had a large navy. We can debate why. One answer is, and it's an interesting answer, India was not a great exporter. You know what a great importer. You know what Indians imported? They still do. Lots of it. Gold. Indians love gold. But the textiles went, spices went, and the gold paid for them. From the 16th century, India imported huge amounts of silver. And you know where the silver came from? The Potosi mines. Vasco da Gama, the epoch of the arrival of the Portuguese. Around that time, 1500, 1492, the Spanish, Vasco da Gama is of course Portuguese, Columbus in search of India gets to America, Amerigo Vespucci, the conquistadors. Major transformation because of the conquest of the Americas is the arrival of silver as currency in India and China. And these were very rich societies whose exports enabled them to get this silver. So it's interesting, in Mughal India, the payment of revenues in silver. Imagine if you were paying in silver. You can't imagine it, can you? See, it's the population is about, there are various estimates, 115 to 170 million. And we know from the work of the great Irfan Habib that the percentage of land under cultivation was small. Possibly as low as 1/3 of the land was under cultivation, maybe 1/4. One result of this, how many people here like ice cream? And how many of you like parathas? And how many of you like butter? And how many of you like ghee? Well, I have news for you. If this was China, very few hands would go up, because Chinese, for various reasons, are not a lactose tolerant society. South Asia is the largest lactose tolerant society on earth. So everyone in this room is in distinguished company of the largest lactose tolerant society on earth. So this society has over centuries kept large herds of cattle. They're not new. So I have a late colleague, Delhi University, where I taught, Professor Nagendra told you, who wrote a remarkable doctorate, which he published, called From Hunters to Breeders, Sahu, based on archaeological evidence. This transition in very early India, 15,000 years ago, from hunters to breeders. Remember, they remained hunters. They didn't give up hunting, but their primary source of livelihood shifted to breeding. I don't know if you ever tried to think of what are the animals kept in India as livestock. There's a huge number. Most of our milk from the 60s comes from the buffalo, not the cow, because the fat content is higher. Then there's the cow. Then there's the goat. You don't think about it. There's the donkey, very important for a long time for Kumhars and certain communities. Then there's the yak. Then there are many yak hybrids with other domestic animals. There's the zoo. There's an animal in Northeast India called the mithun. Right? I might be leaving some out. There's the camel. See, I almost left it out. Very important in northwestern India. In Ladakh, there is the Bactrian camel, very rarely seen, but it's there. So that's 9. Now, the result of having these large amount of animals is probably that the cost of ghee in 18th century India and 17th century India was less than today. So next time you have to pay lots for your ice cream, milk or butter, you should remember that at that time they were paying less. And there's a simple reason. There were lots of cattle and lots of fodder available. Now, this society becomes a very different society within 100 years of British rule. Between the 1760s and 1850s, there's the huge expansion of British control in India, the East India Company, and eventually the Crown, 1857-58. But the most critical thing is that India provided the armed forces that conquered much of the world. The land army of the British was funded out of Indian land revenue. This is very critical. It's very critical. Next time you read about why large superpowers today are hesitant about war. The Americans remember what went wrong in Iraq. The Soviet Union remembers what went wrong in Afghanistan. Remember that the British had something they don't have. They had the British Indian Army fighting for them. Now, why would you die for king in another country? There's a whole book called For King in Another Country. Please read it. This is unfortunately or fortunately not a history lecture. I have to come back to the environment. Let's come to the environment. This huge land revenue tax pays 50% of the expenditure of the empire is on the army. It's very important. It's not spent on welfare, education, health. Second, except in Punjab and parts of South India, there's very little spent on irrigation. Punjab is different. In the late 19th century, the British create the largest canal network in the whole world. It's a remarkable canal network. Much of it went to Pakistan after partition. The Satluj, Beas, Chenab, Ravi, Indus. And this canal network, they settle huge amounts of cultivators. And from them, they recruit people for their army. They divide them into groups. Hindu Jats, Sikhs, Punjabi Sikhs, Muslims. So their regiments will fire against each other and they send them out to fight in the First World War and the Second World War in huge numbers. And this landscape is transformed. Prior to the settlement of the Punjab, there's a beautiful term in Hindi, Sarkar ne zile ko basaya. The government has settled the district. It's a literal meaning, it has settled the district. Area which was not cultivated has been cultivated. Viran ko abad kiya. The desolate has become productive. But it has a second meaning, which is the pastoral activity. The semi-nomadic groups have been crushed and removed. And earlier, for centuries, the Indus Basin had semi-nomadic pastoralists or nomadic pastoralists who would migrate up the Indus into the mountains, up to the alpine meadows, come down, and they would fertilize the soil. And for 1 or 2 generations, the soil remained fertile because of the nitrogen content being high. You see, when you fold the cattle, the sheep or the goats, all of you are science students, lots of you raised your hands. You know that the droppings of the sheep and the goats are very rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And you know that young plants need potassium for building. And plants always, the basic cell structure of plants needs nitrogen and potassium. And this linkage breaks down. So it's a very major transformation. Southern India has a different story. We are in the former Vijayanagar Empire. My father's family came from Tanjavur and the Kaveri Delta. Here, they repaired the older dam systems or canal systems or reservoirs or tanks. They restored a lot of the old tanks which were there. They rebuilt the Chola Anicut in the Tanjavur Kaveri Delta. And in any case, the rivers of southern India were not perennial, unlike the North Indian. If you remember your school geography, North Indian rivers are perennial. The second major transformation. How many of you heard of a boy called Mowgli? Jungle Book? You have seen some version of the Jungle Book? Very few people here may remember what Mowgli did when he grew up. I am tempted to ask you what you will do when you're grown up, but I won't. All people over the age of 18 feel very angry. They say, we're already grown up, we're adults. How dare you ask us that question? Fair comment. Well, when Mowgli grew up, he was not fortunate and blessed enough to go to Azim Premji universities. Very few universities existed like this. In 1893 rather, when I think that's the year, I may be wrong on the year, Kipling wrote the first essay which went into the Jungle Book. Kipling was a journalist in Punjab. He'd never gone anywhere near the Central Indian jungle. The entire story is made up based on things he read written by other people. See, he had a wonderful imagination. But please be clear, he's a deeply racist man. His notion of India, Indians, Irish, blacks is deeply offensive to our sensibilities. This doesn't mean that he was not a wonderful writer, which I'll come to in a moment. When Mowgli grew up, he became a forest guard. He worked for the Indian Forest Service, not in the officer class. So the first essay of the Jungle Book ever published, not the first chapter, says that of all the departments of the British government, the most important is the Indian Forest Service. The lads who are trained in Prussia and France come and they ensure that the young saplings grow into mighty oaks, which provide timber for the sleepers, for the trains, which go out with soldiers to crush rebellions against the Raj. This is exactly Kipling. And then he describes young Mowgli playing with a bunch of wolves, and he shows the German Inspector General of Forests. There were the first 3 Inspectors General were of forests, were of German origin. So the Forest Department gets set up in the 1860s. By 1900, they've taken over 1/4 of the land area. And he's quite right. The sleepers of the railways are a major driving force. They're not the only driving force. A lot of revenue is generated. And as a great historian of the forests of the world, Michael Williams has said, this was a major administrative achievement of the British, but it left a festering sore in India's body politic, which is running to this day. The exclusion of herders, shifting cultivators, trappers, hunters, fishers, cultivators, and the sharp conflict of the forester and the poorer rural folk. Those who live within the forest or near the forest
who have regarded the forest as part of themselves or their lives. So look at two major changes. Perennial irrigation with modern technology and water as a priced good and the enclosure of the forest. Let me come to a third, which I am particularly interested in. See, for centuries, going back to the time of the Magad kingdom, which predates the Mauryas, 3rd century BC, even earlier, 6th century BC. There's a very fine scholar called Troutman who tells us that India was the place where something very important was invented. The war elephant. See, elephants caught, trained, and sent into battle. Elephants don't go into battle. There's no reason for them to. They do it because humans capture them, train them, and send them into. Which humans captured them? And this is, I think, very important. One of my issues with people from the sciences, if you'll forgive me, is they use the term human as if all people are alike. This is very easy to illustrate with another era. When you look at a kingdom or empire, we know that everyone is not equal. There is a term in Hindi, Raja or Rank, the ruler and the ruled, or the king or the queen and the commoner. Easy? Okay. So the rulers protected these elephants in Hastavanas, elephant forests. Kautilya, Arthashastra gives 9 Hastavanas. You know where the westernmost are? You're going to be really surprised, out of your wits. They are in Saurashtra, Gujarat, and in the Indus Basin. So the elephant had a much wider range at that time. The elephant, by the way, had a range even going into Syria. It's a much different climate and vegetation complex from today. It's 2,300 years ago. Now, why it changed, how it changed is complicated. And the Arthashastra says the Saurashtra elephants were small in size, but very angry and evil-tempered, very difficult to capture and train. Unfortunately or strangely, southern India doesn't figure in this list. Maybe it was not under real control of the Mauryas. They just had titular control. Who captured the elephants for the king? Forest peoples. They paid tribute through elephants. Who needed protection from elephants? Cultivators. Because the elephants came out of the forest and attacked the crop, as they do today. So the elephant, to control elephants, the king needs to do both. Capture the one from the forest to deploy in war. Bring the forest people into a set of relationships. But protect the cultivator because land tax still has to be cultivated. So there are 4 entities. The king, the forest people, the cultivator, and our friend, the elephant. It's very important. The war elephant is invented in India, exported across Southeast Asia and West Asia. For those who are interested, there's one battle, 5th century, in which Asian elephants fought African elephants in North Africa. You will be happy to know, or you may want to know, since everyone wants to know who won, who lost. The Asian elephants won and the African lost. But they were probably African forest elephants, which are smaller. They were not the bush elephant which you see on Animal Planet. Now look at another very interesting relationship, the exact opposite. India has had horses for centuries. There's a very fine song of Gulzar. Those of you who don't watch old Hindi films will know this song even then. It's from the film Masoom, which was made by Shekhar Kapoor. And there's a little girl and 3 kids sing. See, you're nodding already. Lakdi ki kaati, kaati pe ghoda, घोड़े के दुम पे जो मारा हथौड़ा, and it says दौड़ा दौड़ा घोड़ा दौड़ा दो मुठा दौड़ा. Note the following sentence. घोड़ा अपना तगड़ा है, देखो कैसी चर्बी है, चलता है मेहरौली में पर घोड़ा अपना अरबी है. So it says, look at our horse. The skin is so glossy. It's so healthy. It grazes in the fields of Mehroli, which that time was outside Delhi. Now Delhi is swallowing it up. But our horse is an Arab horse. So the best horses in India were Arab, Persian and Turki horses. They were the ones prized after, the way a Cadillac might be today, or a Merc. And they were exported through 2 routes. They trotted through the Khyber and Bolan Pass because they were bred in Central West Asia. Or they were brought on a sea route. So Vijayanagar, for instance, got its horses through Goa. It's very interesting. Are you realizing it? They're paying for these horses in silver. This horse route continues till the 1830s. And elephants continue to be deployed till as recently as 1945 in the Second World War, when 3,000 elephants from India and Burma served in the Allied armies. Our friends fought and died in the Second World War. Many of the elephants, poor fellows, also died in it. So it's very interesting when you look at animals, cattle, domestic animals, horses, elephants. They've been very important in our lives in a multiple host of ways for centuries. Let me complicate the picture. See, in 1972, the year of the Stockholm Conference, there was a coup in India. You never heard of this coup? I hadn't either. The lion was replaced by the tiger as national animal. The tiger became the national animal. The lion had been national animal for 3 years, from 69 to 72. It was replaced by the tiger. When Dr. Karan Singh, the chairman of the Board for Wildlife, he would soon be chairman of the steering committee of Project Tiger, was asked why. He denied that it was because his nickname was Tiger. He said it's nothing to do with that. And he then said that there is a reason the tiger is found in 11 of the 16 states. So it's a symbol of unity in diversity. So this is when the tiger became Indian. Up to then, Indian government referred to it as the Bengal tiger. So in West Bengal and Bangladesh, they still refer to it as the Royal Bengal tiger. Associations with British royalty who shot it, supposed to be the largest tigers. I won't get into whether they are or not. To me, it doesn't matter the size of the tiger. I think this is a leftover from the era of trophy hunting. But the tiger became national animal for one more reason. There were very few of them. And he went on to say that tiger as national animal would rally people to protect the endangered flora and fauna and extend support to this national effort, nationwide effort, to save it from extinction. This was something new at that time. That's the first time India counted its tigers. They'd never had an all-India count of any vertebrate other than human beings. 1881 was the first decennial census of humans. The first time India tried to count its tigers was in 1972. They went around counting pug marks. Now, the system of pug marks, very criticized now by scientists, had an uncanny resemblance to the fingerprint. Remember Angota Chap? Well, that origins lay with a member of the Imperial Police Service who worked it out actually in the 1900s in India. All the Angota Chaps of the world originated here. So there's a lot of administrative innovation going on in India. And the tiger census gave very startling results that the number of tigers was very small. So to build up tiger numbers, Project Tiger was launched. But I want to stay with this idea of saving an animal and the animal being national. So why does an animal become national? Why is it picked out? And here there is something very significant about nation states. Nation states try to develop their economies. Their power, politically, economically, militarily, is not only a function of their size, how big they are. It's not only a function of their numbers. Kitne aadmi the, to quote Gabbar Singh, very famous person in Indian cinema history in Sholay, which is also celebrating its anniversary. 1975 was release of Sholay, 50 years ago. But it's the size of its economy. You know, one of the very important speeches of the ruler of the Soviet Union, Stalin, is made in, I think, 33 or 34 before the Central Committee of the party. He says something of absolute significance, irrespective of whether you not agree with his politics or his pretty awful methods. He says, Russia has been invaded many times. The Khans, the Tatars, the Beygs crushed us. We have 10 years. Either we endure or we'll be crushed again. And he is referring to the build-up of the economy through what were called the 5-year plans. Now, it's very important. The developing countries believe that if they don't develop fast enough, particularly with a substantial industrial base, they will be dominated again. It's very simple. It's not anything complicated. It's not rocket science. This is true of Brazil, it's true of South Africa, it's true of India, it's true of Southeast Asia. And one of the reasons is that many of them went through this long colonial imperial epoch. And the debate today at the global level is not just about who takes the cake, how you divide it up. It's about who takes the costs. And there is a reality that most of the developing world, still, there are exceptions. China is a very important one. China, as you know, is the world's largest exporter of manufacturers. It's the workshop of the world, the factory of the world. It is to the world of today what Britain was in the 19th century, the United States was in the early 20th century. Have you ever thought about it another way? The smokestack industries of the West have shifted to China. That's one reason that Western countries have lower pollution rates. Have you ever thought of that? The only catch is that China exports to the rest of the world. 120 countries, their imports from China are greater than from US or Europe. But there is an issue here, which is, will countries such as China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Vietnam go down the same route that developed countries, the West or Russia, went down, leading to the spoliation of their environments? Will we add to global environmental challenges, costs, concerns, or will we find a different, better way to do this? This is a very serious question. It doesn't have an easy answer. Nobody has the answer. There are parts of the approach in different countries. This has a counterpart, and I think it's a very important element, which is, just as there are divisions between countries, there are divisions and disparities within countries. So you look at a country like Brazil, 1/3 of Brazil is the Amazon. That's a very large area. What should happen to the Amazon? Should it be a frontier which enables growth of, say, large cattle farms for beef growing, and beef remains a major export of Brazil? So earlier to the United States, now it is to China. Brazil's economy is still built on 3 large exports: beef, corn, soybeans, and interestingly, oil. Earlier, these were to the United States, now they're to China. In the case of South Africa, much of its manufacturing comes from the West. It's highly dependent. So how do these countries spread their environmental costs internally? So with the Amazon, the alternative to opening up the Amazon and creating these huge farms, which are largely owned by a handful of people, can much of the Amazon be retained as forest with extractable reserves, community reserves, and conservation areas, which Brazil has experimented with varying degrees of success. I refer to South Africa, which went through a long period of very harsh regime known as apartheid, sharp separation of the whites and the blacks. The Indians who know about the history of the very pernicious practice of untouchability, it's no surprise to us that societies do constitute this and codify it and try to implement it very, very inhumanly and often through barbarous torture. This was overthrown in 1994. South Africa is a democracy. But it's a very unequal democracy. It's about as unequal economically as Brazil, which historically had a huge slave population. It had an even larger slave population in the United States. And in South Africa, it's interesting, 10% of the land, 10-15% of the land is game park. 5% is national parks owned by the government, which has tried to be very participatory. They've tried to bring in communities in a major way. They were earlier a symbol of white supremacy. The Kruger Park, for instance, was set up as a symbol of white supremacy. Kruger himself was a great general. He fought against the British. So in the conciliation of the Brits and the Boers, they created parks like Kruger. But 10% of South Africa, I want to emphasize, is private parks, which are owned by rich whites. It's a very highly unequal society in economic terms. How do we, in a democracy, move towards equality? It's a big question for economists. I won't go there. But it's a similar question for those interested in the environment, in terms of environmental entitlement, access, or in terms of environmental costs. So the international situation is tied in with what is happening within countries. This is true of the largest economy on earth, the United States. I don't know how many of you are aware of the very large civil rights movement in the late 1960s in the US. But one of the drivers of civil rights was that many people of color were not only poor, they were exposed to air pollution, water pollution, chemical dumping, disproportionately. It was as much for access to equality in schools, in education, in health, to use the same restrooms, to go into the same shopping malls, as it was against pollution. So we come back to a very interesting paradox, and I'll end with this, which is that we live in a planet which is one entity because of the biosphere, the very thin film of life that covers the surface of the planet. The hydrosphere, the stratosphere, the lithosphere. There are a variety of life forms in it which we share spaces with. But the impact we have on these life forms is not only a question of how one approaches the question in terms of the natural sciences. It is as much of a challenge for our polities, our economies, our societies. And there are two things which emerge very clearly from the larger picture. Whatever we do can't be within the space of the nation state alone. Our beginning has to be within each nation state. But this journey has to be across nation states. So if you look at, say, the Himalayas, the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Ocean, it's very clear. We have to cooperate. The alternative, the Soviet Union had a very famous prime minister. Please don't emulate him. You know what he did? He went to the United Nations, he took off his shoe, don't worry, I'm not going to do that, and he banged it on the table because nobody was listening to him. Half the crowd was not listening to him. He wanted to attract attention. He sure did. All the papers of the world next day showed Premier of Soviet Union banging the shoe with the table. It's never happened before and it'll never happen again. He lost his job some years later, not because of that. So I think he said the opposite of peaceful coexistence is warlike non-existence. It's a lovely quote. The opposite of peaceful coexistence, living together peacefully, is warlike non-existence. We won't exist. Now, this is not true in a direct sense or literal sense. But there are many ways in which we may be close to, over the next century or two, breaching certain planetary boundaries. This almost happened in the ozone layer. There are many scientists who argue that it will happen when we breach certain levels with greenhouse gas emissions. But there are many other planetary boundaries as well. I'm not getting into that. So there has to be a cooperation between and across nations. And there's the other challenge. Whatever we do on this journey, we can't accomplish it alone. It has to be collectively. So how do we work cooperatively and collectively? And I want to emphasize, there's nothing in the history which will give us a magic silver bullet solution. So I put this rather provocative subtitle, Why History Matters More Than We Think. Does history matter? We are dealing with cadmium, lead, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. Through much of history, these didn't exist, at least not as human-generated products. How can history possibly help? Isn't it some old subject about kings, queens, Raja Rani ki kahani, something which happened in 1688, did or did not happen in 1206, who succeeded Rajendra Chola? I would argue that that's a very warped notion of history. History is also about how the past shaped the present. The past shapes the present in a number of ways. And there are both intended and unintended consequences of human actions. All humans are not alike. There are different humans with different levels of power, wealth, access to technology, different ranks and statuses in society. And their collective individual actions have brought us to this pass. And by informing ourselves better, we will be far better equipped to handle a complex future. Because in this future, there are 2-3 kinds of new challenges which are part of a common global issue. How do we live with other species? Do we want to have diverse ecological systems? How do we deal with future generations? These are large questions. I don't have answers, but I hope I have provoked you enough so that we can think about these questions. Thank you.